Well, thank you very much. And yeah, I occasionally get asked for advice, and I'm really careful about that because I don't like telling people what to do, and I don't think publishers want to be told what to do. We're very clear about actually with our services that we're not prescriptive about how the tools are used. Um, but if there's one piece of advice that I would give to every publisher, it would be use ORCID. It's not just because ORCID is useful now. Um, it can help us to find um, problematic articles. It can also help us to assign credit to authors for their work. Um, but also it means that we are prepared to deal with problems in the future. The more that we use ORCID right now, the better off we will be in the future when we have to deal with problematic research. So the second piece of advice that I would give to publishers would be, for goodness sake, use ORCID, um, because it really is very important. One of the things that we do, we talk about this quite a lot, is network analysis, and that is about connecting things. Here we're looking at authors, and this is a particular piece of analysis that we did some time ago. And what it shows is individuals and the connections between them. So when two authors are connected on this visualization, that means that they have both appeared in the same author list on a research paper. When the line is red, that means it contains tortured phrases. Tortured phrases are a pretty good smoking gun for something being up, but they are rare. But in this community, they are not rare. They're very common in this community. So these are people who all know each other, and there's a problematic practice that keeps coming up again and again. One of the really important things that we can do is try to be more proactive about handling research misconduct, because it's far better for a publisher to understand a situation like this one and be able to say, okay, here are some individuals who have this practice that we have a problem with, and decide how they're going to interact with those individuals in the future now than it is to do it when the paper comes in at some point in the future from this community. Um, so one thing that the data does is it gives us the option to be proactive and to understand these individuals as much as possible early on. This work was actually done with OpenAlex author IDs. And so it comes with a big caveat, which is that those IDs are built on algorithmic disambiguation. The work OpenAlex have done on that is really great, but it is not perfect. Um, and that means that for every individual in this analysis, we have to accept that where they appear more than once, it could be two different individuals. And when we're doing something like fraud detection, which is very, very sensitive, we need to be extremely careful about that, because we cannot be 100% sure that it's the same person. ORCID, we get a lot more certainty. Um, so I've said this before, the business of fraud detection is first of all about identifying an author, and that's really critical, and then connecting them to bad behavior. But actually, um, right now, this part is the hardest part, and ORCID is the best game in town to be able to do this. And again, it's not just about doing it right now. It's about doing it in the future when we have to go and look at historic records. Um, the dodgy behavior part, actually, that's a lot easier. We've got lots of data sources that we can use for that. The biggest problem right now in scholarly metadata is author disambiguation, and ORCID is the best tool for addressing that across everything. There's something really nice about um, the situation that we find ourselves in the publishing space, which is that time's always going to be on our side. So the longer that somebody has a pattern of bad behavior, the greater our chances of catching them. And so I've often said that it's really important to know your author. There's a set of practices in the finance world called KYC, which is know your customer. What I've always said is that you got to know your author. And again, ORCID is a great way to do that. And that's not just about identifying fraud. There's another example which I gave some time ago, and sometimes people misunderstood what I meant when I shared this before. Because again, it's all about time. So we look at the person on the right. That's somebody who has got no history, an empty ORCID, no, a fresh webmail address. So it's somebody who seems to have come out of nowhere. And this is a very common feature of paper mills. It's these individuals who've got no history. Now, this is also a common feature of early career researchers, of course. It's also a common feature of emerging economies. So particular geographies where we're going to see more individuals coming into science with no history. And what we don't want to do is say that because there's no ORCID history, we should judge this person. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that where you have somebody you can say, okay, this person really is completely green. Let's make sure that we know our author. Is there more we can do to verify this person? For example, get them to sign up with ORCID. That could be one thing. Also, we can go and just have a look at their institutional webpage. There's a few other things that we can do as editors to just make sure that we know who our author is. It's not about judging the author, it's about knowing them. The other thing that we sometimes see, though, is people with a long history. And generally, that's a really great thing because if they've got a very long history on ORCID and there's tons of stuff in there that we can analyze and investigate, well, then we can be pretty confident that there's no problem there. This is somebody that we can trust. The really great thing, though, is that in a situation where it's actually both of them, and we do see cases like both of these, it's the one on the left. That's the one that's a really easy one to do the analysis and understand if there is a problem there. So I'm going to say a little bit about how we do that. So Oversight is our web app. It's the first index of research integrity. It allows you to see research integrity patterns at industry scale. So here we're looking at everything published in the last decade, which is every single article has been analyzed by our methods. And there's a few interesting things here that you might recognize. Our red alert curve, these spikes, by the way, these are just 1st of January. So every year, articles get published in annual volumes. Because we don't know what date to assign to an annual volume, we just put it into 1st of January. So that's why you see these spikes. This inflection point where the curve changes, that's the same time that Hindawi suddenly reduced their publishing output. And we can really see that in the data. And there was another drop from a few other publishers throughout 2023. And then we saw a rise again in 2024. In all of these graphs, you'll see a drop at the end. That's just caused by it taking time for data to feed into the system. Yeah, so don't worry. Science is still there. It hasn't gone away. So this gives us a kind of high level overview, and we can dig into that overview a bit more. We can go and look at, for example, institutions or funders. Here's a funder with a very clean record. We can look at a publisher, and this is a publisher with maybe not such a clean record, but we can also track how the trend has changed over time. They seem to have had more of a problem in the past than they have right now. So that's good. We can look at a journal. And this journal clearly had a very big problem that was dealt with. But ideally, we want to be able to look at individuals here as well. And the more ORCID data there is, the more that we can do that. As of right now, we can look at partial data with ORCID, and that does get us a long way. But the more of it there is, the clearer and more complete the picture will be. So let's talk a little bit about that, about how that looks in Oversight. So what we have here is a submission to a journal. So we integrate with all of the major peer review platforms. We're integrated with Editorial Manager, ScholarOne, and a number of other smaller platforms. So submission might come into ScholarOne, look a bit like this, and we get an alert and we get a link. And the link will take us through to the report. Now, the report immediately shows us some interesting stuff. We're going to look at a few different reports here. These aren't all the same article. Here we have the article itself. Okay, that's the big one in the middle. Then we have the stuff that the article is connected to. So this is starting to look at that network that we talked about at the start. These are references. Specifically, these are references that also have alerts on them. So we know there are issues with these articles, and we are saying that there's quite a lot of these that this particular article is referencing. If it was one or two, maybe I wouldn't be too concerned, but those could be accidents. But in this case, it's eight or nine. But then we can also see these dotted lines. And these dotted lines tell us that there are shared authorships between these articles. In fact, there's also shared authorships with the article itself. So what we're seeing here is not just the authors citing problematic papers, they're citing problematic papers that they themselves have written. So this is a pretty compelling image. I mean, we can tell there are problems here, and we can see the structure of how those problems are related to each other. This is enabled by ORCID. So what we don't want to do when we're doing something like misconduct detection is assign the wrong article, especially a problematic article, to the wrong author. So here we're using ORCID, and we can be very sure that the same person has been involved if the same ORCID is on two articles. Let's see. We'll also show that data in a list, which makes it a lot easier to digest. You know, exactly why are we flagging these articles in an author's history? In this case, we're seeing an article in an author history. Again, this has been found using ORCID data. And this tells us that, let's see, another article written by the same authors appears on a list created by SmutCloud. So that is a freely available list of data created by a sleuth who has gone in and investigated this article himself. So we find a lot of data that comes in from sleuths. We also receive data from publishers, and we receive data from our own analytics, which will appear, which will tell us about these sorts of problems that we find in an author's history. Sometimes we get a huge amount from ORCID. Where there is no ORCID on an article, or the publisher has not required that the authors put ORCID in, at the moment we won't surface anything. So the ORCID connects the article to history. And the more of that history there is, the better prepared we are to deal with these problems when they come up. So it's really critical that we have the ORCID there. We can also go and look at the author history as a list. And where there is a lot of ORCID data, we can get a pretty huge list out of this. There are some cases where it will be hundreds of articles. So here we've got a few articles in the author history, and we've got a few findings on them. This one seems to have been triggered seems to have triggered a deep learning pipeline. And if we look down that right-hand side, we have this relevance score. Now, that can be very useful in a few ways. One way is, as we're seeing here, we've got a really high relevance on one of these, 83%. Now, that's a subjective measure in the sense that 83% means a different thing for different articles, because relevance isn't really a perfectly quantifiable thing. But that's still really high. And what that could tell us is it could tell us that these two articles have been written with the same template. Sometimes that goes hand in hand with paper milling, so it could be worth checking. It could also be a sign that they're the same article. And sometimes that comes up. We see two edited versions of the same article in two places. Or salami, where we have two articles that are very, very similar. They're on the same topic and they don't really say much different. And we'll get that with that relevance metric as well. Where it sometimes gets super interesting is if we scroll down to the bottom of the list. And then sometimes we find articles in the author's histories that are completely irrelevant, not relevant to this article at all. And there can be good reasons for that. But we'll surface that really easily so that you can see it. And you can have a look at it and you can say, okay, looks like this author changed fields at some point. That's fine, no problem. But what we see sometimes is we'll see an author who's got a history of writing in one field, and suddenly they've got a paper in another one. And that paper triggers a bunch of other checks, a bunch of other flags from Clear Skies. What happened there? And that goes hand in hand with authorship for sale. When somebody needed to get another paper into their CV, and so they just paid for any paper. So those cases can be quite interesting, and they're a bit of a smoking gun. We can do the same analysis on the references, and actually the references show us similar things. The relevance is also quite useful there because we'll see things like referencing to templated papers. When relevance is very high, that can show us that as well. And irrelevant references, again, another thing that comes hand in hand with Papermill papers. One thing we'll also surface is self-citation rate, but usually we'll calculate that on the names because in case the ORCIDs are missing in the references, it will affect the calculation of self-citation rate. So we generally won't use ORCID for that. We'll use just the names. But ideally, that's how we'd be doing it. If ORCID was everywhere and it was in all of those references, then it would be the ideal way to calculate metrics like self-citation rate, for example. One quick thing about templates. So I mentioned templates before, and we'll see these sort of highly relevant articles in a reference list. Now, in this case, we have two articles that are highly similar to each other and appeared in one of these reference lists. Now, I opened these up and took a look at them, and it was abundantly clear that they had been written with the same template. What's really weird, though, is that the authors are different. Different authors, different institution, but somehow they're writing with the same template. And that is possible. It's possible that two sets of authors at different institutions will share a template. Nothing wrong with that. However, this template in both of those cases was retracted. So what that's showing you is that the template articles have been retracted, and also they're being flagged by one of our other detection methods. Now, doing that check was pretty easy. It didn't take me very long. But one thing is that confirming that the authors are different on that's something that can be completely automated with ORCID. It shouldn't be something a human being has to check. Ideally, we can just check that with a fully automated ORCID check. So in summary, ORCID doesn't just help us identify problematic histories right now. It prepares us to be good at detection tomorrow. The more ORCID data there is in the system, uh, uh, at the moment and in the near future, uh, the better prepared we are to do this kind of data analysis and find these kind of problems as they come up in the future. Oversight shows ORCID data, um, and it tracks patterns at industry scale. And ideally, the more ORCID data there is, the more we can show you, um, and the safer we can make the whole system. So that's everything. Any questions?
Thank you, Adam, for that presentation. I'm going to give everyone a few minutes to collect their thoughts and submit their questions via the Q&A. Some questions that we did get at registration that we'll go ahead and start it off with.
Sure.
We kind of touched on early career researchers and how it may seem that it may be a suspect author there. But the question would be, how can early career researchers whose ORCID records may be less populated than established ones demonstrate to publishers their bona fide scholarly credentials? Any suggestions or advice there?
Um, I think that if somebody is coming in completely green, we need to have a system that will welcome that and will say, okay, this person is not experienced, not uh, not an insider, whatever that might mean. But it's a system that says, okay, well, you still get a chance. You still get to um, submit your paper to peer review, to get fair consideration, and to get to get help as well where that can be provided. And I think that's something that it's one of my big concerns about as people see more and more research fraud coming into editorial offices. I think it means that an editor might become a lot more suspicious of anything that comes in, anything from someone they don't recognize. And uh, that I think is a really big problem. So one of the nice things is that, we can run that through the content-based checks that we have. So we've got lots of checks that are not going to run on someone's history. So someone has no history. It's okay. It doesn't matter. We'll check the content. We'll check the references, and we'll see if there are any problems there. So that gives the editor a lot more confidence about what they're dealing with. Um, and I think having worked as an editor, the thing that I would always want to do with a case like an article like that is just get it out to good referees. And I mean referees who are going to give it very fair consideration, but also give it very detailed feedback. Because that way I can have a lot of confidence when it comes back with an acceptance recommendation that this is definitely a good paper that I can accept. But also it means that if there's still work to do on it, then the author is going to get good feedback as well. So coupling the tools with editorial judgment is the key. So we can't expect a future where everything is going to be done by humans. Um, there's going to be a lot of automation in the future, and that is only going to increase and continue. But importantly, it has to be done with that human in the loop, guiding the tools.
Absolutely. You've touched on it briefly about bias if you start seeing a
Mhm.
lot of the same thing come through. Any suggestions on how to avoid bias, or is there any concern that as we get more automated, that our AI tools will develop their own bias?
Um, so bias, actually, one of the main reasons that I built the original Papermill Alarm, which was the first tool for detecting these large-scale paper mill fraud cases. And the reason was that I would go around and talk to publishers, and they would say that they were very concerned about a lot of papers they were getting from, for example, Chinese hospitals. There are huge numbers of fraudulent papers coming from Chinese hospitals. But that, of course, meant that if somebody wrote a proper real paper who was at a Chinese hospital, then they were at risk of dealing with bias when they came to submit that. And so the idea here is that we have an automated solution that's based entirely on statistics. It's just based on pure data and on statistics. And that is an antidote to that kind of bias, which, we could say that it's something that we might judge that bias as being very unfair, but also I think when people had very little information to go on, I think it was maybe very difficult for people to not be biased in those situations. So that was one of the things that we really wanted to address with that original version. I think where it comes down to um, uh, bias elsewhere, for example, in automated tools. So we do a lot of work with LLMs, and one of the issues that you're going to have with LLMs is that there will be bias within the LLM, which you cannot see. And it's very, very difficult to find ways to measure that bias. And there is no way to make an LLM completely unbiased. Again, that just can't be done because the data that's going in is potentially everything on the internet, and everything on the internet is not everything that could possibly exist. It's a biased set of things. And that means that those biases will be there in the underlying tools that a lot of integrity solutions are going to be built on in the future. I don't think we're ever going to get away from that. So that's why, again, the important thing is to have a human in the loop who is thinking rationally and thinking, okay, this is a very intelligent machine, but it is still just a machine, and it can't really make um, a judgment. What it can do is it can recognize patterns and save me a lot of time, but I still need to be the one to make the judgment, and I still need to be responsible for what this for what happens at the end, irrespective of whether that is something that the machine participates in or not.
That makes sense. Thank you. I see a couple more questions coming in. This one is also related to, early career researchers. Would you say that if an early career researcher has known co-authors from their institution, does that give a cue that this may be more trustworthy than another type of record that doesn't have such information attached to it?
Sorry, what was the start of the question? I missed this, the beginning of it.
Sure. If an early career researcher is attached to or has known
Hmm.
co-authors from their institution, is that a cue that this is more trustworthy?
Um, Potentially. I mean, if we're going to see that, somebody has come into a really, we're inferring here because we're saying that somebody's come into an environment where they've got a really good culture of doing good research, and we've got good evidence of that by looking at other people in that group, or perhaps their co-authors. Then yeah, I think that does give us more confidence. But I would say that that still requires a human to make that inference. It's not something that the tools are going to do. Um, the other flip side to that is that there are so a friend of mine, he told me that he worked in a group. This was 25 years ago, in the US. And he said people in that group were simply making up their results and publishing them. And they'd put anyone in that group on those papers. So he was going into that group as somebody who knew absolutely, nothing about doing real scientific research. And he would get put on those papers. So his name is on what are essentially milled papers from a quarter of a century ago. And I remember he asked me, he said, well, would those papers be picked up by your tool? And I said, well, actually, we're only looking at the last decade of stuff here. So they wouldn't. But that's not by design. That's just because that's the way that we engineered it. When I thought about it, it's like, should there be some sort of some like statute of limitations on this kind of thing? And maybe maybe there should in a way, because the question is there room for forgiveness? And I see a lot of publishers building watch lists of individuals that they think have done problematic things. And I think there has to be a question there about, when do we decide that somebody is forgiven and that we trust them again? And also understanding of the circumstances around which these things happen. The reason we've seen so many fraudulent papers from Chinese hospitals isn't because uh, doctors in China are in some way untrustworthy. It's because they have targets which they have to meet, which they are unable to meet any other way. And we have to understand that context. It isn't necessarily fair to say that just because in one place we have particular expectations, that those necessarily apply to everyone. So again, it's like more reasons why there should be a human in the loop to be able to see those things and be able to um, make a fair and balanced judgment based on the situation. Also, I should say my friend went on to have a very long and fruitful career doing real science. Uh, so it's a um, it is absolutely possible for somebody to go from an environment like that. They go into an environment like that, and through no choice of their own, they get involved in something that they don't want to be involved in, and then go on from that and still contribute. So I don't think it's I think it's very clear that there is gray area. We can't just lump people into boxes.
Exactly, exactly. This next question is more about the tools that you have. So, what triggers an article to be flagged as red or orange? For oversight, what determines that an article is considered as part of a paper mill?
Hmm. There are three things which I sort of touched on here. One of them is content, and that's where we're seeing patterns in the content that are um, consistent with industrial production. And one thing is templating, but not just any template. We have to have seen that the template has been identified at some point in the past and reused again and again. We even see that in Gen AI content. So we've been doing a lot of analysis with a Gen AI tool from a company called Pangram recently, and we're still seeing the templating patterns in these papers. So it's really interesting that you can get an AI to build anything, but actually there's still patterns in them, and that really comes from the fact that you need a subject area where there is scope to keep producing papers on different iterations of the same thing. So you have a machine learning algorithm study on whatever, different algorithm, different thing, keep changing it. You can write millions of papers. So we see that in the templating. It's actually quite a limiting feature of paper milling. So there's content, and then there's the local network, which is the stuff that we looked at, where what is this connected to? Author histories, references. Then there's the global network. And that is looking at, let's look at absolutely everything, connect it all together and say, which things have the highest degree of connection to problematic things. So we had an analysis called Keystone, which will take individuals and it will say, how do we connect these to problematic articles? Which individuals do we connect the most? And build a huge big list of those. Run it through some disambiguation to prevent the kind of risks that we talked about, but accepting that we're never going to get that absolutely perfect. And then spot check it. And that list went through a lot of spot checking, and we didn't actually find any false positives in there. So we always found something else, some evidence that somebody had done something. So, like I say, there's those three different ways of looking at it, and I think that's quite fundamental, actually. You look at the kind of intrinsic things, and you look at the extrinsic things, and you compare them, and that really is everything. In terms of how we flag things, we'll flag on the basis that the main sort of paradigm is retraction prediction. So we can say we've got retracted articles. These are articles that absolutely should not have been published. Can we predict that? And some of those are based on they're retracted. Well, most of those actually are retracted because of misconduct. So that means that we can say, okay, we're actually predicting misconduct, but the problem we're trying to solve is, can we predict whether something's going to get retracted? Um, and we've done that time and time again now. There have been several mass retractions that we have um, alerted the publishers about long before they happened. Um, and what we're saying is when something has an alert, that means that we would have a low false positive rate on that problem. And it's important to understand that that is a problem that we're doing with test data in a test environment. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that this is absolutely definitely a true positive, but it means that we've got things here that are very consistent with something being retracted. Therefore, it's worth taking a closer look. And that's still a relatively small proportion of the literature that will flag that way. So it doesn't take up a lot of time to look at those things. But as we have seen, it pays off because we do find problems there. And we also find a huge amount of detail on the kinds of things that we need to investigate. We have these references, we have these author histories, we have other features of the article. And that's how we define a red alert, low false positive rate. We also have the orange alerts, and orange alerts we're saying, well, we'll allow false positives here, but we'll say, where are the lines that we draw to try and make sure that we are not missing anything? And that's a slightly more subjective process. But we're not going to flag anything as orange unless there's something significant, because we want to make sure that we're only flagging things that are worth someone's time to look at. And with reds, you can expect there to be actionable insight as well.
Very helpful. Thank you. And it's obvious that a lot of this work that you've just described is very proactive work. And during your presentation, you mentioned sleuths. Is the work that sleuths doing also proactive? Or is it more passive where they come across something, they notice it, and then they do something about it?
I think possibly you would have to ask an individual sleuth about that, but I think that possibly that's the difference between a sleuth and anyone else, is that they are proactive. This is actually it's a really interesting area where we have people who do voluntary work who are really extremely good at finding problematic science. I can think of examples of people who they're not even scientists and they can still find problematic science by looking at things like image patterns in the images, things like that. And so I think there's a huge amount of value in that sleuthing community. You've got people who really care about what they're doing and really will go into a lot of depth on things. And generally, at least the people I know in the sleuthing community, they will not flag something unless they are really, really 100% sure. So there is a lot of care that goes into it. That said, a lot of them, it does start from a sort of a reactive place in the sense that maybe their story of how they got into sleuthing was they were reading a paper and they thought, there is no possible way that this paper went through peer review. I've had that experience, and it really makes you wonder because I can think of like a paper that I looked at one time where it was so badly wrong that I think I must have been the first human being to read it. I don't think it's possible the author read it. I don't think it's possible that any referees read it or any editor or anyone in a production team. I think it got right the way through the entire process without a human being actually reading the words on the page. And I think it's experiences like that that make people want to dig deeper and really, find out why things like that are happening.
For sure, for sure. It sounds like there's a lot of integrity within that community as well, which is great. And then speaking of community, someone has a question. Are there any collaboration or networking opportunities among authors that can enhance integrity and quality of work that you know of?
That's a great question. I think it's actually one of the really great things about peer review and why I think peer review is quite fundamental to science is that it's the one place where there should be some assurance that a human being has looked at the work. So it means that we have work that has come into contact with another human being. So if you have, and that human being should not really be that connected to the original work. So if you have, for example, an institution that's just pushing out tons of rubbish, and the work could be really bad for lots of reasons. It could be that actually they just don't have good research standards and they don't know how to do science very well. In which case, that comes into contact with peer review, at some point, someone is definitely going to write back to them and say, "Hey, you're doing this wrong. You have to do this thing this way." And so peer review isn't perfect. You know, the articles can go into through the peer review system without anyone reading them, as I've said, and get published. However, um, the fact that that system is there means that um, it is very difficult for a persistent problem to get through. One thing that we absolutely see, and a lot of publishers will have seen this as well, is paper mills trying to work around um, the peer review system. So things like creating special issues, trying to bribe editors, creating fake referee accounts. We see all these things, and there's no way that that would happen if peer review was not effective at dealing with paper mills. So it absolutely does work, despite examples like the one I mentioned before. Um, and so yeah, I think more collaboration definitely between authors and people working in different areas, different institutions is always going to help. But I feel like something I've always loved is that peer review is there, and it's always going to be the point where science comes into contact with humans. And I think that is fundamental to science being science. Um, if an AI writes it and an AI reads it, I would argue that it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist until a human reads it.
Fair enough, fair enough. And speaking of peer review, next week is actually peer review week, and I'm sharing a link in the chat to the official peer review week site so you can check out events and resources there. And if you're not already involved in peer review, you can learn how to get involved, and there's some cool events taking place too. Um, our next question is what's the one thing that Clear Skies would like to see more of in scholarly data to help their mission? And how can different stakeholders in the research ecosystem help to contribute that?
Number one, ORCID. And that's not just because this is an ORCID webinar. Um, for all the reasons I've said, it really is ORCID. There's a funny thing. We often talk about detection things and detection methods and false positive rates, and everyone's, oh, we always want methods with low false positive rates, and we've always said that as well. I sometimes I go and buy something in a shop, and I'll take out my credit card and I'll tap it, and every now and then it will say you have to put your card in and type your PIN number out. That is a false positive. That is the bank or the credit card company saying something unusual about this transaction. Now, I think it does it, every now and then anyway. But if you go to a shop you don't normally go to, you're in a different country, somewhere you don't normally shop, that will happen. That is a false positive. Every single time that has happened to me, it's been a false positive because it's been me holding the card. Um, but do I mind? No, I don't mind because I'm really happy that the bank is checking that no one is using my credit card without my permission. So, um, if somebody comes in to submit a paper, I think publishers are often concerned that if they ask all the authors to authenticate with ORCID, then it's going to put the authors off and potentially they don't get the submission and they potentially lose revenue. But I don't know if anyone's ever really tested if that's true. Because certainly from my perspective, if someone else, a co-author, is submitting a paper on my behalf, and then I get an email saying you need to go and authenticate with ORCID, which would be 2 clicks maybe to go and do that. I would feel exactly the same way about that. It's the publisher ensuring that nobody is trying to put my name on a paper without my permission. And so I think that that process of getting everyone's ORCID on there is completely automatable and probably would be welcomed by a lot of authors. It might not be straightforward. It might be easier said than done because some publishers won't have the technical resources to make something like that happen. But I still think it's very valuable. The other way to think about it, though, is like I say, there are different methods for finding this stuff. Some of them have a very high false positive rate. Now, if you were to put those in at the submission stage and say, actually, most of the time we don't need to have all the ORCID data because we're concerned that we might lose submissions if we do that. Well, as a middle ground, if you have a method which says, actually, okay, let the normal ones go through that way. But when something looks a bit odd, we can have a really high false positive rate on that and only then automate the process of asking all the authors for their ORCID authentication. And the great thing about that is that that's not going to offend a lot of authors. It's not going to do a lot of harm. Again, could be easier said than done. But if someone is running a paper mill and they have this one publisher that they go to, which always asks them for all the ORCIDs, and they have to find a way of figuring out how to sign in all these different accounts. You think, I'm not going to bother with that one. I'll go to one of their competitors and put it in there. So I feel like there's a huge amount of scope to handle this in quite a nuanced way. We're not saying that these sorts of methods will completely deal with the entire problem. But there are so many little things that can be done that are gentle nudges that push against the problem and make it much more manageable and potentially mitigate it as well. And I think those are things that we should think about. And ORCID definitely helps in that sense.
It's great to know and great to hear. I also think that helps give some more information to the other question that's in the Q&A that I can see Shavindra from ORCID is also replying to. Someone is interested, is it possible to see which journals, publishers, other systems are actively using your systems?
It is to some extent. We've always said to publishers that we won't promote their use of the services. And that was partly because there was concern at the start that some publishers were worried that if they say they're using services like this, it looks like they're admitting to having a big problem. I don't think that is the way things are interpreted anymore. But still, we'll have standards of client confidentiality around that. I think that there is a list. I don't know if it's publicly available though, of the publishers using, for example, the STM Integrity Hub. And there certainly are a huge number of publishers using our tools through that interface, and that might be one way to see that. Otherwise, anyone who does want to announce it, we will announce it, and we will at some point put it all on our website so people will be able to see who's using the tool. But we do have a large number of publishers, including several large ones, signed up now, and that actually also has a big bearing on the analysis, because when we find problematic content in the submissions, we can model that without any data being shared between publishers. And that means that when a problematic article comes in, it can get modeled, it can get rejected, it can get submitted to another publisher, and we've already modeled it, so we know how to catch it, and we'll catch it immediately when it comes in. So that's one of the really great things, is that without any data sharing having to take place, there can be collaborative effort that benefits everyone. One question that came up actually, which I remember I didn't answer, was about the definition of a paper mill. And it's quite interesting actually, because paper mill means something that produces fake papers. However, there are cases where people produce real papers and sell authorship slots on them. So it's not really the perfect definition. Um, then there's the question of, if one person produces one fake paper, are they a paper mill? How many do they have to produce to become a paper mill? Um, and I think it's become, as we understand more what is going on, it's become a less useful term. Um, Actually, one of the terms that you hear a lot is plagiarism. And that's usually in reference to people copying text. But copying text isn't necessarily plagiarism. It can be okay to copy text in certain circumstances. Plagiarism specifically means theft of ideas. And interestingly, you can do that without um, uh, without necessarily copying text. You can steal someone's idea. When we come to paper mills, the problem is very similar. It's someone taking credit for something they haven't done. And there are lots of different ways that happens. And I think we need to try and be more specific about what they all are rather than just calling them all paper milling, because there's quite a few different things there: authorship for sale, fake papers, fake referee accounts, lots of different things that the behaviors that we see there. Um, but uh, but yeah, maybe, I said there's the one piece of advice I'd give, which would be use ORCID. I guess the other piece of advice, the thing that I think is really critical to research integrity, is people always say, like, always cite your sources. And I actually think that is fundamental. If everyone just always cites their sources, then, and that's the source of ideas, not just the source of data, code, or whatever else someone is doing. Uh, a lot of these problems go away. People can really do science badly, and I've got a huge amount of tolerance for that. Uh, but if people are doing science dishonestly, that's where we see the worst problems, I think. So anyway, sorry, that was just to answer that question.
No, no, it's very helpful, and it ties into what I think may be our last question that's perhaps a little speculative, but something to think about. What do you think the possibility of paper mills recognizing and ultimately avoiding the publishers using these tools is?
It is a perpetual cat and mouse game. Um, I wrote a paper about detecting um, research fraud in peer review comments in 2021, and it came out in start of 2022. And the logic there was that if we put it out, it could get out to more people could use it. Publishers could see it and they could say, okay, we've got this idea, let's go ahead and use it. Now, once that had gone out, I had two publishers come to me and say, hey, we used this. We copied what you did in the paper and we got the same results. I thought, great. So it absolutely worked. We got this idea out and people used it and they got results. But that was the end of it. There was no ongoing understanding of how it was affecting things, how behaviors were changing, whether me putting the paper out had meant that paper mills had learned this is how we're getting caught, let's try something else. Um, and that's one reason why we've been a lot more careful about how we put things out. We want to build the business relying on methods that are very difficult to work around and are primarily based on understanding the business model. That's really the core thing. If we understand how they make money, it's very difficult for them to work around checks that detect that sort of process. So a good example is where we're looking at the references. They have to reference their own content. They monetize that. So if we've detected stuff in the past, we can just look for that in the references. And we can tell them that. We can tell the paper mills that's how we catch them. Because the only way that they can work around that is to stop monetizing references, which is actually good because it means they have less money and they have less ability to pollute the literature. So we do think about this a lot, but fundamentally, and if you look at fraud detection in any industry, it is a cat and mouse game. You will find ways to catch them. They will find new ways to do fraud. And you can't predict the creative thoughts they might have in the future about how to do fraud. So you have to constantly work at detecting the new things that they're doing and building methods to identify those. That is the reality of fraud detection, and uh, something that we've always known and always worked with.
If only they could use their creativeness for good and not fraud. What
Yeah,
could we have in the world?
yeah.
Well, I want to thank you, Adam, for your wonderful presentation and the engaging Q&A today. The work that you and Clear Skies do is very important and much appreciated by the community. I'm going to share final links in the chat to invite folks to our upcoming webinars and check out anything you may have missed on ORCID On Demand. So thank you again, Adam. Thank you, everyone who joined us today, and we hope to see you all in the future at another webinar. Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
Kimberly. Thank you. Bye bye.